Summit, but if we had thought of it, we could have called this the the Upstate Economic Summit, the Suburban Economic Summit, something like that. But we're very glad that you're here, and by virtue of the participation, I think it shows that we have a topic of great interest today for all of you to join and participate in. But I do want to say a word of thanks. Where is Ferdinando Bruno? Aren't you right up here? So there, Ferdinando, thank you very much. Our sponsor, Remax Solutions. Thanks so much for making this possible. It's a really great thing. For those of you who haven't been to an event before at the Times Union, at the Hearst Media Center, this place, this used to be a space that was filled with a couple of hundred workers putting out the daily paper. When we built the new press here 5 years ago, we had vacant space. The technology has shrunk our footprint enough that we didn't really need the space. And my publisher, George Hearst, had the notion, of course, that the newspaper needs to be the center of community conversation. This gives us the opportunity to do that literally as well as figuratively. So we've had some great conversations here and some really wonderful events, including, I think our biggest event perhaps was the Times Union inaugural Times Union Upstate Crossword Championship, which was really great. I mean, it is amazing what great crossword players can do, you know. So anyway, let me introduce our guests, and we'll have a bit of a conversation here. Let me say first, here's Hugh Johnson, who many of you know, an investment strategist, founder and chief investment officer of Hugh Johnson Advisors in Albany. For many years, of course, he was part of First Albany Corporation. He's widely quoted in the media, not only locally, regionally, but also nationally, for his view on the U.S. economy and financial markets. And Hugh's annual Economic Outlook presentation to the Albany Colony Chamber, isn't it? Who sponsors that, is sort of one of those must-attend events. We welcome Dr. Laura Schultz, who is senior economist and director of fiscal analysis at the Rockefeller Institute of Government and Policy here in Albany. In particular, her research focuses on how local and state governments can support innovation to generate economic activity. And in particular, I think how universities and industries, entrepreneurs, and governments can harness emerging technologies to spur economic growth. And then Dr. Kahal Lahiri, who is Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University of Albany, considered an expert on economic forecasting and applied econometrics. His Transportation Services Index actually was adopted by the U.S. government to measure the health of the transportation industry, and it is part of the monthly series of reports that the federal government puts out. And he also developed a big data monthly model for New York State revenue forecasting, which is very handy if sometimes depressing. So he is director of the University of Albany's Econometrics Research Institute. I think I want to just start this with a general question. You know, we'll get into the more specific things as the time goes along here, and as we promise people that we will get them out the door before 1:30 comes. But let me just get your overall economic outlook for upstate New York first. Are we, in 2019, are we looking for a slowdown, a recession, or continued growth? Hugh, why don't we start with you? Well, you need to all, by the way, hold your microphones close. Yes. Sorry about that.
Hopefully everybody can, this is turned on and it's loud enough and you can hear me. First, I'm just going to say this. I have two of my associates from Hugh Johnson Advisors, Andrew Halliday and Roberta Rokas, with me here today. They're relatively new to our firm and making a wonderful addition. It's great to have you. And also, you mentioned that I used to be at First Albany, and the chairman, my boss at First Albany, George McNamee, is also here sitting at the table on my right. George told me, he said, well, listen, Hugh, what's your joke for today? And I said, I don't have a joke for today. People sometimes come, in fact, quite a few people come just to hear the joke. I hate to say that, but And I didn't have one, but George said, why don't you try this one? You know, there was a guy that was about to die, or did he already die? But either way, and he was trying to decide whether he would go to heaven or go to hell. And he decided to go up and take a look around. And he went up and took a look around heaven, and he saw this wonderful place, wonderful carpeting, everything looked really perfect, looked really attractive, looked like a good place to go after you die. And then he decided to go down, take a visit to hell, see what that was like, and went down the escalator, and he took a look around. He first of all opened the door. There was a beautiful beach, women in bikinis, people drinking beer and having a great time. And he went back up and he talked to his associates and he said, "This one's really easy. This one's clear. I'm gonna go to hell when I die." And so when he died, he did go down to hell, and he opened the door to hell, and there was nothing but fire came flying out, and the devil was standing there with a big grin on his face, and he said, "What happened? Yesterday I came down here, I looked at it, you had a beach, you had girls, everything was looking one party, everybody had. Yesterday when you came down, you were a prospect. Now you're a client." If you didn't like it, I'd say it was George's, and if you do like it, I'd say it was my joke. At any rate, what do I see ahead for Albany and New York State? The one thing that I've learned over time, and I've spent a lot of time helping in the sort of budgeting process for New York State, and trying to forecast the national economy, the state economy, and then doing the best I can to forecast all of the individual parts, metropolitan statistical areas, counties within New York State. And you see some patterns. One pattern that often seems to come out every year which is important, is the New York State economy. Despite the fact we'd like to say that we have a big impact, they as policymakers, me as an advisor, have a big impact on the outcome for New York State. The truth is, the New York State economy tends to track the national economy. It doesn't vary or diverge much from the performance of the national economy, regardless of the variable, whether you're using gross domestic product, gross state product, or whether you're using employment numbers to reach that conclusion. So I think what's going to happen to the national economy is going to impact the state economy. And I think what's going to happen, the expectation, the current forecast is, I think, sounds pretty sensible or rational, is that we had 2.9% growth in 2018 for the national economy. New York State's going to be a little bit less than that, come in 2018 a little less than that. And things are going to slow down as we move through 2019 and 2020. More specifically, we're to quantify it, we're talking about 2.5, 2.6% growth in 2019, and then down to 2 to 1.9% growth in 2020. I'm going to make one point and then turn it over to my colleagues, and that is we're at the 118 month mark of this cycle. There are 10 previous cycles in the post-war period, a lot more cycles, 25 of them going back to 1890, and this is the longest bull market or cycle since 1890. So common sense alone, I could just simply tell you that these are really nice forecasts. But look, trees don't grow to the sky, and it's very possible that the consensus forecast will change or will be wrong. I'm sure that's not a shock. And if anything, you really have to, I don't want to say prepare, but I'm saying recognize that this one's long in the tooth. So if we make a mistake, if a mistake is made, and George and I spent some time when we were having our lunch trying to figure out the mistakes that are currently being made or about to be made, what configuration of events could make the consensus forecast wrong. And there's a variety of them, and I'm sure you're aware of them. But the point is that this one's long in the tooth. So if you're running a portfolio or you're running a business, use your common sense and say to yourself, I'd like to shift a little bit towards defense. That's not an irrational move. That's even if you don't get the timing right, don't worry about that. The point is that's very rational. So I'm talking positive growth for New York State, positive growth for the national economy, positive growth for Albany. We've got lots of variables we can talk about the risks, in my judgment, given the length of the duration of the current cycle, are on the downside.
Laura Schultz, you see anything, would you depart from that in any way?
No, that seems to be about what I see when I look at the industries that I follow in the high tech sector. I think everyone knows that the long term is really strong, but a lot of the firms are realizing a slowdown is coming or could potentially come. So they're moving to more of a defensive position. So I think you've got it.
Yeah. Everybody hear it?
Picking up on Hugh Johnson's joke, the thing is that I spent some couple of years in University of Florida in the 80s in Gainesville, and there you have the same joke, whether you go to hell or heaven. People say, I don't know, but I know sure I'm going to go to Atlanta. So that was a very well-known joke around that area, actually, because if you were to go through this. Now, getting back to more serious matters, you know, many years ago, Paul S. Samuelson actually destroyed the forecasting profession by saying, well, the stock market predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. Okay? And people joked. They joked very seriously to the extent that the whole leading economic indicators business was ridiculed by the conventional economists, actually. It was a serious joke, but it was very unfortunate. Because right now, look at, say, we are wondering where the current expansion will die of its old age, right? Because it has exceeded 120 months, and so people think that no matter whatever is the reason, it has to die, okay, at some point. And so people are wondering out there. That's why, see, as you said, that if you look at the 2020 forecast, people are clearly downgrading their forecast because they can see that even though 2019 would be kind of lower growth, around 1.5, 1.6, that's a consensus out there. But when you go beyond that, you see people are, getting concerned. And for example, right now, so if the growth is like 1.6, 1.5, it doesn't take much to dip below zero. You see, some shock would take you down. For example, the federal shutdown right now, the estimate is that each week of federal, shutdown takes, say, 0.1% of the quarterly growth out. So already, actually, we have lost half a percentage point for 1 month. Okay. So if we continue second month, you are talking about getting very close to a zero growth. Just this episode alone. Okay, because things can happen which can tip the economy below the zero growth. So the recession, if I have to say, not next year, but clearly the year after is a real possibility. If you look at New York State revenue growth for the last 2-3 months, you see certain signs of going down. If you see the DOB website, they put out a little statement. They just in December didn't look good. They have actually reduced instantaneously their revenue growth by 0.2 percentage point. Okay? But if you do that work more carefully, doing the correct kind of seasonal adjustment, I find that growth to be reflected to half a percentage point less revenue growth actually. So you see, if you ask the same thing 2-3 months down the road, when you see a pattern, December has been bad with the SALT law. New York State is going to be affected tremendously, and so in 2-3 months you would be seeing a more clearer picture of where our tax proceeds are going, and if there's a serious downgrading there, it can affect our local economy quite a bit. So let me stop at this point.
So let's think about some of those places where we might stumble, as you referred to. For example, Eric Anderson, our business editor, was just telling me that this morning there are reports of troubles perhaps lying ahead for the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the new NAFTA, that some of the newly empowered Democrats in the House are saying that there are too many issues that are not included in the proposed agreement. What happens if there are problems on the road toward a finalization of that deal. Dr. Schultz, you want to start with that one?
I think that one industry that I've been following closely on this that's been negatively impacted by a lot of the trade war issues is the agricultural industry. We're doing some work out in Western New York with rural communities, and they're immediately seeing the impact. And the agricultural industry makes the decision now that will impact the next year. So that is a real stumbling block for ag firms because you're making decisions now and the effects are going to be felt for multiple years. And I think just the in general uncertainty associated with all of the trade agreements with China and with the next NAFTA or the USMCA, MCCB,
Yes.
has a lot of firms reluctant to make investment decisions and reluctant to figure out when to invest their capital to try to time it appropriately to see what the new normal is going to be. So I think that is going to be a major factor in business decisions.
What about the farmers? I mean, with China as a major stumbling block there, I would think that agriculture would be a great concern on the horizon.
It's very, very important, but keep in mind this. First of all, Jerry Shea, who really knows more about this than anybody in this room could ever guess, is in the audience, and he's sitting out there. Raise your hand, Jerry. If you have a question on trade, I'm not saying you, Rex, I'm happy to try to answer it. He's certainly somebody that's really knowledgeable about this issue. Let me just, without spending any time, just cut to the quick. When we're talking about agriculture and the trade deals, we're really talking mostly about China. And just keep in mind some simple configuration of events. Both China and Donald Trump have a great deal to lose if this deal doesn't go through. In the case of China, we're talking about $500 billion. Our exports to China are about $100 billion. Their exports to the U.S. are $500 billion, which is really important to the Chinese economy, which is currently deteriorating or slowing significantly. And part of that export picture, of course,
You want his bump?
our exports
Oh, okay. I
to
thought this
China
guy.
is soybeans and agricultural products. Donald Trump wants to win the election
I feel like
in
Well,
2028.
just so you know,
He wants to
the
do
girl in the
something
middle is
for
on the
farmer
same
vote.
mic as same
So
channel
Donald
as the
Trump
guy on
wants
the
to
end.
go through.
He
China
said
wants
his
to go
voice
through.
isn't strong,
So
Okay.
I think that's kind of what it is.
Okay, they're up.
And
I
he has
booked
a
them.
thick
China,
accent, so it's
because there's so
Mhm.
much at
even
stake
harder.
Sure, they're bumped up.
both China
Sure, no
and
problem.
the US. And I think that's probably true of Mexico, although I don't understand a lot about the details of the Mexico agreement or deal, as they're called these days. But with China, it's really important. So I think the China deal, I don't look at that as being a real risk to the current, there are lots of risks to the current economic outlook. I don't think I would put that one particularly high on the list.
Dr. Gary, what risks do you see to the current economic outlook?
You know, in my mind, all the uncertainty on this trades and so on and tariff that's happening, it's creating a huge amount of uncertainty in investors' mind. So that, and economists are talking about policy uncertainty at a level, and that how that is really dampening, taking the steam out of entrepreneurs. So, as you said, at the end of the day, it is inconceivable that China and Donald Trump is not going to work out something. Okay, I don't see that. But quite independent of that, Chinese economy is slowing down, and that's a big gorilla in the room, right? I mean, that slows down by 1-2 percentage point. It will have a huge impact on the rest of the world. You look at the European economy; it is slowing down. European economy. So US is still pumping quite well, but it can only do so long, right? With the trading partners slowing down. So the trade deals, we have to see what happens. But the uncertainty that is creating right now regarding that is affecting the economy, I think.
What about the volatility? Dr. Schultz, you were talking about the how we see so much of this now. Aren't consumers becoming more inured to the ups and downs of the stock market in particular? Are we is the market's impact on consumer behavior being diminished at all as a result of the fact that we are seeing so much volatility all the time now? Any evidence of that?
My instinct would be that consumers are not necessarily following that market up and down. There are going to be a subsegment of consumers that follow that relatively closely. You're planning your retirement in the next 5 years. Perhaps you're going to make different decisions, but I think the base of consumers don't follow the Dow Jones Index on a regular basis. They do look at it to assess whether or not the long term, try to think about whether the long term is going to be a factor for them. I think one of the things that we're going to be seeing is consumers may be holding off purchases this quarter until they find out what the tax situation is going to be, the true impact of the tax cuts they're going to have on their pocketbooks.
And are business leaders similarly not paying that much attention anymore to the market volatility, buying managers and so on?
Yeah, you can't help but be affected by it when you see the kind of levels of volatility. And I mean, whether you're a business person or whether you're simply an investor, that's among the many things that go into the calculation surveys that measure consumer confidence, and more importantly, consumer confidence is consumer expectations. And I hate to bring it up, but if some of you watch these numbers carefully, take a look at the decline in consumer confidence that occurred in the month of December. It plummeted. And I don't know what the reason was. You know, there are good things that happened. Employment growth was quite strong. But obviously the stock market volatility has really affected a lot of people. I can only tell you among clients of Hugh Johnson Advisors, they're generally pretty confident, pretty happy with everything that's gone. We've received, and I'll probably ask you folks, but we've received more calls from people that want to reduce their target for equities in their balanced portfolios, that they are concerned about it, they are troubled by it, they are troubled by the declines that occurred between September 21st and September 26th. That was a 19.1% decline in it. And I think that part of the reason for that is that they have good memories and they remember 2007 and 2008. And I think to a great extent they're worried to death about a repeat of 2007, 2008. So I think that the level of volatility does affect confidence. And you bet, Rex, that confidence, that especially the decline expectations, does affect spending. And it could start, I don't think it is yet at the point it'll start a vicious cycle or a circle, but it is troubling to see that level of decline in confidence. 1 month really doesn't matter. You need to see 2, 3, 4 months in a row before you can take it seriously, but it's certainly troubling to see 1 month of a decline in confidence, the level of decline we saw.
So consumer confidence and trade deal with Canada and Mexico and our trade posture with China. Another impediment that we may think about would be perhaps Brexit. Is there an impact? Are we? Is the ocean our great insulator? Is there any likelihood that a hard Brexit? Is there a problem that we are seeing at all in our outlook in the U.S. as a result of the troubles that are going on across the pond? Any thought there? Dr. Schultz, you want to start that? Do you have any sense there?
I think people are watching it cautiously, thinking about how they would change their European investment strategies, how they might affect companies. Perhaps are thinking about, do you invest in Britain? How is that going to change the European markets, and whether or not you build a plant in Dresden or Singapore or in Albany? But I'm not sure I would see a big impact on day-to-day consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I agree. That's a great question for Jerry Shea, if anybody really wants to get the answer. But at any rate, I don't think, I think people, we are watching Brexit. And it introduces certainly to businesses that are doing business in the UK as well as in Europe, it introduces a level of uncertainty. And nobody really knows the outcome. I can tell you what my guess is. My guess is we're going to see another referendum. I think we're postponing past the end of March 29th for sure. And whether it's going to be a disorderly Brexit, an orderly Brexit, or a new referendum, nobody has a clue. Nobody knows for sure. But I'd be willing to bet we're going to see a new referendum. It may be the same outcome, but nevertheless, there's going to be something that'll delay it. And that, incidentally, is kind of a positive. That's why he's had sort of a positive reaction or response by the UK, by the sterling. They look, I think people look at that as being positive. So, but I agree with you, Laura. It's probably not, it's not one of the big issues that we're thinking about. Federal Reserve policy is a big issue we always think about. What's going on in Washington, the disarray in Washington is a big issue that we think about. Prospects for the economy and earnings we always think about. Those are bigger issues.
You know, you talk about the things that you make you feel good. Brexit, I think, makes me feel better about the United States Congress. You watch the House of Commons and you think, well, at least we're not that.
No, but with respect to Brexit, what you have to see is that look at Ireland. I mean, Ireland is a net gain out of this because a lot of this business will move on to, as you know, Ireland. But Brexit, one or other, I don't see how it can affect USA really. If you're talking about its effect on USA, we had bigger problems to worry.
So let's talk about a couple of big long-term problems, the issues that they are talking about in Davos. Since we're not there, we're nice and happily snug here instead of being in that really godforsaken place. One of the issues that was discussed yesterday at some of the convocations was the wealth gap. You know that the widening both nationally and globally, and I believe we see the same effect locally. Do we see that any abatement of that in the capital region? Does our large public sector employment here in any way insulate us from the impact of that? Or is our growth long-term in the capital region going to be affected by income inequality?
Yes, we're not going to get away from it. It is true that the very high, and when I'm saying high, 26% of our employment in Albany County is, as you know, federal, state, mostly state, and local government employment, and that certainly provides some stability and prevents a widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots to the extent that we see for the country as a whole and for the globe as a whole. There are lots and lots of reasons for us. Certainly the rise in the stock market, as the rise that we did see in the stock market, certainly benefited very well. The number one driver, and all of the studies seem to clearly emphasize this as being the most important, is the fundamental shift in the U.S. and the global economy from a labor-intensive economy to a knowledge-driven economy. Everything I look at says the same thing. And we can talk about this for a long time, but the people that have lost their jobs because they don't have a high level of education, I guess that's a crude way of saying it, those jobs are gone for good. And this process of disenfranchising those that are less well educated, and I'm sorry it sounds snobbish, but that's the truth, because of the exponential progress of technology, that's not stopping. That's going to continue for a long, long time and present, in my view, enormous public policy pressure of what to do about it. I don't know what to do about it, but I don't see that there's any significant change. Many people will be disenfranchised, and they will remain disenfranchised unless they do something about it, which of course is to improve their knowledge level. The economy is shifting from a labor-intensive economy to a knowledge-driven economy,
So
and
we're gonna start
that's
with
with
the
us, gonna
concept
be with
of
us
a
for
very
a long, long
coarse
time. It's
UTM.
a really,
So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna write down a coordinate here. So I'm gonna go 1, 3, and I'm gonna go
I think that
0, 4.
the capital region is helped by
So
the fact that we're
this is
one of the
sometimes
most
referred to as a 4 figure,
with a very high number of people.
but the first number here is gonna refer to as the
Here
easting,
in the top.
and the
20.
second number here is gonna be our northing.
So that
So
protects a lot
what
of
we
our
wanna do
people,
is
that
we wanna
protects a
go
lot of our workers
in the door
who are
and then
going
up
to
the
be in those
stairs. So that's how I
high income jobs. And a lot of our growth has been knowledge driven in the capital region. A lot of what's gone on Fuller Road and the introduction of advanced manufacturing requires people with advanced degrees.
You made it to
And that's
the
been
end of
great.
the
And the
section.
goal,
Great work.
if
At
you
this
create
point, I would
even
like you to
more
open up your workbook
wealth
and go
disparity
to the end of
when
that
those
section
jobs are
on
filled
map
with people who come
coordinates.
in
And here you're gonna find a number of
versus
questions to
training the
really
people locally
practice
to
the skills
prepare
we've
them
just talked
for
about.
those jobs.
So coordinates are one of those things that
So,
it takes
I think
practice
if
to
we
get
want,
used
I
to.
agree that if we
So
want to
you're gonna
add
fill
a
out both the questions in the workbook as well
wealth
as
disparity
2 of
in
the
the
3
capital region and
PDF
in New
maps
York
that
as
I
a whole,
put
you
down
need
at
to
the
focus
beginning.
on education
And we're going to
and
answer a
preparing
number
all
of
workers
questions
for
and see how
those
we do.
knowledge.
Remember, I'm here to help you, so if you have any questions or it just doesn't make sense, put your question in the comment section below, or if you're more shy, email me, Morgan at lemontrails.com. I'm here to help you master these things. So hit the questions and we'll go from
I
there.
think that type of training has two benefits. First of all, it does help prepare those people and give them longer careers with less uncertainty, with higher incomes. It also attracts more companies into the region because companies are ultimately looking for a highly educated labor force who are going to be more productive. So it is a good investment to make because it's going to have multiple effects on multiple fronts.
In this video, we're going to go over a little bit more in depth on how to understand map scale. So we're looking again at the Mini Glacier National Geographic map for Glacier National Park and Watershed National Park. And if you remember, this map has a 1 to 50,000 scale. You can tell by the bottom corner here. And that means that 1 centimeter on the map equals 500 meters.
I mean, you know, experience from the Obama year, when
So most
spent
compasses
one
will actually have a ruler on,
investment that's
and you can confirm that for yourself. You can line it up to scale here, and you can see that
the multiplier was way more than
centimeters
one.
gives us
Many others were
1
less
kilometer.
than one. The money that we
So
spend
wanted
on
to, for
education
example,
and stuff like
figure
that,
out what is the widest section
but the money that was spent
Upper
on
Waterton Lake.
transportation,
We can start measuring and say, okay, well, this is
people that's going to
2,
But getting back to your where little money should be invested,
5. So the
I
widest
think it's really
east-west
clear that,
section
for example,
of
the
Waterton
two-year
Lake
colleges,
would be
like
2.5
you're connecting with an
centimeters, which is
four-year
going to
colleges.
equal
Investment has to be
1.25
invest to
kilometers.
make more
And
PhD.
of course, if you wanted to double check that, you go
You
down to your
invest
scale,
where you can
and
get
you can see that
technical training. You have
2.25,
carpenter, you this and
or
that.
if we do the opposite,
Germany is famous for that, right?
2.25.
So the money, public money should be spent at that level. That is two-year colleges, high school level, where you teach people to do things. Okay? And there's a huge difference.
learned in the last couple of days that was interesting. I thought it was fascinating. One of the reasons why the U.S. economy has grown or expanded at such a slow pace during this recovery and compared to other recoveries is because the growth of the population is slowed, the growth of the labor force is slowed, and productivity is not as strong. There's really an interesting change going on, and that is this, is that for whatever reason, the growth rate of the labor force for the nation as a whole, but also for this area, all of the counties in this area, is the growth rate is starting to pick up and get much stronger again. That means the prospects. In other words, you have to have the growth of the labor force. The labor market condition too tight. Now they're starting to loosen up a little bit because the labor force is now starting to grow again. The reason for that, which is really surprising and dovetails with what we're talking about, and the best I can tell, is that women are coming back in. The participation rate is starting to get better. Women are starting to come back into the labor force. That's number one, and that's because, for some reason or other, because of a change in the population, child caring and caring for elders is less now among women. Maybe they've reached an age, the demographics may have changed so that they're doing less of that and starting to come back in the labor force. That's number one. Number two, which I found very fascinating, the women that are coming back into the labor force are the well-educated women. And that's very consistent with what I'm talking about. So I find that everybody says, look, the economy is slowing. It's gotta slow. Why does it have to slow? Because the growth rate, we're at full employment. People are just not, we're not gonna grow the number of jobs. We can't grow the number of jobs, it's too tight. The labor force is too tight, it's all too tight. Not true. It's starting to go the other way because a very interesting change is going on, and I think everybody should be aware. We might add more jobs in 2019 and 2020 than we're currently expecting, and that I think will be a surprise to everybody. I don't know if that's at all clear, but believe me, if it isn't clear, I can tell you it's important.
No, but the labor force participation of women has been increasing over the last 20, 30 years. Steadily it has increased, and for the men it has fallen down over the years. But very lately, for the last 4 or 5 years, we see that actually the rate of growth of labor participation is leveling off between men and women. So the age that we had with women, we are losing that. That's a very late information that you know that is, I'm saying at a national level, okay? But I agree that the labor force in a place like Albany has to come from non-traditional labor force like elderly. Lot more people are working beyond 65, for example, and those are very experienced labor. Lot of immigrants. This area, as you know, if there's a little population growth, if you look at the immigrant, you'll see that it can be attributable to that. Okay? So far as you have kept the doors open for immigrants, you'll have a steady flow of labor in an area like this, where you're not going to get the conventional labor to be sticking around. That's my take on the issue.
The reference to technology here, haven't we seen something of a slowdown in, well, certainly in capital investment in the Fuller Road corridor? You know, it's kind of built, and so the question is, what does the technology community in the capital region look like in the post-Calieros era? Is there still a growth potential there? Is there more that we, and what might we be doing? We've talked about education, and then is job training. If more women are coming to the labor force, is there anything else that we ought to be doing in the community to make our technology sector stronger?
Part of it is that there's been trends, right? I mean, the economy moves in a particular way, and it's an Albany area. If we talk about the Albany area, our government is a major employer here, and healthcare sector is another big employer here. That's always been there. So that's going to be there that way. Education is a big sector here, whether nano college, nanotechnology or not. Global Foundry is there. That's a big boom for the area. So for I'm concerned, okay, that's the production, that's the construction, right? And they're expanding. That's a positive news. But overall, you have to look at the sectors that have generated historical employment in this area, and those areas are health, education, government, and areas like that. And I don't see any way that is going to go down in the future. So in future, I think the potential for employment has to stay in those areas. And a lot of it is incorporating a lot of technology. Like big data analytics in the healthcare sector, as you know, is changing the whole shape of the industry. because of the new technology in data analytics and so on, right? And that's one way the high technology is getting embedded in our education, health, and all these sectors across the board.
So I think one of the things this region has that very few other places in the world has is we have the expertise on the technology, on the hardware, on the computer chips, on the medical devices here, and we also have the expertise in healthcare. We have we have multiple major hospitals. We have a medical school. We have New York, which is a big state with close access to that educates. I think I heard 16% of the medical doctors in the country, between Albany and across the state in New York City. That really positions us, New York, to be the leader in developing and deploying these advanced technologies. And I think it's universally accepted that the integration of new technologies into healthcare is going to revolutionize health outcomes. It's going to revolutionize the economy. So there are a lot of opportunities here. We have the expertise, we have the know-how, and I think that we need to continue to invest in that. And I don't think that there has necessarily been a slowdown in the post-Caleros era. I think it is an industry, the semiconductor industry is an industry with just a handful of players with only so much capital to spend. There are only so many plants that get built every single year. It's an international competition. It was unreasonable to expect us to get a new plant opening every 6 months. But the investment's still being made with the $800 million investment from Applied Materials being announced last week. So I think the signs are still strong that the infrastructure in the capital region here is good, and ultimately companies don't make investment decisions based on where a college president buys his car. They are not swayed necessarily by Caleros. They have far more complicated optimization functions than that.
I'll tell you one sector that is in decline, not only here, but we certainly feel it, and that is retail. Brick and mortar retail is, of course, in trouble, and that has implications all over the local economy. Is there, you see anything that might perhaps fill that gap as major retailers close, as buying shifts online? Is that sector big enough in this community that we need to worry about it? And is there anything that can be done?
I can remember my friend George over here 10 years ago when I told him I was going out to Sears to buy a lawnmower or something, and he said, "Oh, you're going out to the future warehouse," and and he had this figured out a long time ago, and the shift from brick and mortar to internet, I don't have to tell anybody here that that's just not going to change, and it's just simply not going to change. It's an ongoing part of the whole process of this shift from a labor-intensive to a knowledge-intensive economy, knowledge-driven economy. So, no, I think really the good news is that the capital region, really with the education and healthcare, a significant percentage of our, we talk about government being 25, 26% of our employment base. That's not good news from the point of view of, if you look at the productivity numbers, the output per man hour in government is really low compared to almost every other industry. But we also have a lot of work. We've also done really well in professional and business services. That's 13% of our economy, or 13% of our employment. That's one of the top 5 in productivity or output per person. And also right at the top is healthcare and education. So we've got good news and bad news. I know this is going to shock everybody, but or maybe not, I don't know, but information services is only 2% of our labor force. And I think if there's anything that can be done, and I was surprised by that number myself, is to try to do more in that area, because that's where output per person is really solid. But believe me, the capital region is done really well. My big problem, of course, is, as you can see from the numbers in the handout that I gave you, is that this still is a downstate, upstate deal. Downstate is where the growth rates are very high, and the upstate is where the growth rates are okay, but they're not very high. And fortunately, with the exception of Ithaca and Tompkins County, that to me is, somebody's got to explain that to me. That's phenomenal. They're doing really great. But with that one aside, and even with that one included, Albany's really at the top of the upstate crowd. So so there's kind of good news and bad news, but I don't see any change in that downstate upstate divide.
Doesn't Ithaca speak to education as the driver of the economy then?
Here,
Yeah, and here
Oh.
as well.
education and healthcare,
Yep.
it's 18%. Government, of course, is 26%. Healthcare is 18. Healthcare and education is 18%. That's pretty big, and it's a very productive sector of the global economy. So we should be happy for what we have.
So what about a couple of political problems? For example, the fact that there seems to have now been some agreement in Washington that federal deficits don't matter, that we're going to go ahead and let the debt run free. The tax cut enacted last year added 1.5 trillion, I believe. Is there what kind of a peril are we seeing as a result of the rising debt, the seeming loss of concern about annual deficits, and is there any way to reverse that? Anybody want to?
Be happy to, but I'd love to let one of my colleagues here say something.
Yeah, that we lost the microphone there. Oh, is it? See, did that get turned off here at the bottom? A little button there.
Is
There we
it?
go.
Okay. Every 10 years, you see, we go through a cycle where the deficits build up, and then the next administration comes in and picks up the job in terms of trying to reduce it. And then again, next 10 years comes and goes up, right? We have been going through these cycles over the last 30, 40 years actually for the US economy. So you can imagine, same thing is going to happen. Our budget is going, budget deficit is going to blow up in the next couple of years, yet to be corrected by the next administration, right? Because there's no other choice. So it's happening from the time of the Reagan, right? That this cycle. So we'll pay the price at that point because there'll be cuts everywhere, right? You remember the initial time of Clinton, a lot of cuts took place, right? The education took a lot of cuts, NSF, NIH. And you go through that painful experience, and again it builds up. So I don't see any other, way out. It has to be the same story repeating itself.
Thank you.
This is a serious problem, and we've gotten away with it for a long time, and that's because it hasn't reached ugly levels. You need to read the book the work by Reinhardt and Rogoff, and they talk extensively, and I think some errors in the work they do, but pretty extensively on deficits and debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. Let me just say two things. We're talking about risks to the economy. This is a real risk. And here's the risk. The risk is that the deficit as a percentage of GDP is now moving up towards that 5% level. And the reason that's such a significant risk, it's a high number, period, but the reason it's such a risk is that if you remember back to the early 80s when we had the Reagan tax cuts, those Reagan tax cuts were rolled back in 1982. And they were rolled back because the deficit got up towards 5% of GDP. Congress thought they were too high, and they were right. If we get monetary restraint, in other words, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates in 2019, maybe 2020, I think that's probably going to be past the peak of the cycle. But nevertheless, if we have the Federal Reserve leaning towards restraint, raising interest rates, and we have a move or shift by the Congress towards fiscal restraint, they'll raise taxes or cut spending in order to deal with deficit that's getting up to 5% of GDP, you could have this is scary, but you could have a repeat of the 1937-38 problem where Roosevelt got cold feet because the deficit got up to be 5% of GDP and he reduced government spending and we went into a tailspin in the stock market and a tailspin in the economy. So it's the response by policymakers in Washington to deficits that are going to get pretty bad when we started getting into 2019. So that's one problem. The second problem is the debt as a percentage of GDP. It's getting up towards, it's not there yet, and won't get there till 2024, 2025, when it gets up to be 90% of gross domestic product. Read Reinhardt and Rogoff what happens then. Because, you know, we've gotten away with it for a long time because it hasn't been anywhere near 90%. And it's going to get there. And it's going to get there in 2023, 2024. So I don't know what the answer is, but I can tell you that it is a potential real issue.
But if I take it from there, the thinking about the Roosevelt area or the Great Recession area, we are in a different regime altogether. We have now so much of built-in stabilizers in the economy. Think about welfare payments, Medicaid, Medicare. These are built-in expenses that the society does on people. So there's a limit how low it can go, in my mind, when you start, say, cutting the budgets and the Federal Reserve tightens federal funds rate and so on. So I don't think there's a chance that where you can get into a great recession or something. Unlikely, because there's a lot of built-in expenses that are part of our life these days. Half of the budget is on support systems.
But there are greater challenges at the same time. Think about another issue they're talking about in Davos, which is climate change, which presents a huge potential resource drain on the economy in an effort to try to ameliorate it, and which we are at this point doing next to nothing about. Do we have an opportunity to avoid? Is there a way to avoid crisis in that regard? Isn't that going to present a huge economic challenge?
That's why you change governments, right?
Yes.
And so it's a cycle again, right? You wait, and your turn would come, and then you get back on those again and try to clean up. That's the way I look at it. I mean, this is part of our political system, right? We go through balance and checks and balances, and certain excesses are cut out, and then you get back on and try to get back to those good stuff on the environmental things and so on. And so it's again a political cycle like that.
Since we are here at the state capitol, let's just focus a little bit on state policy. And Dr. Jones, I'll turn to you about this one because these are huge trends that we're talking about as well as local impacts. But think about what the role that a state can play, even a state the size of New York, which independently might be the 7th largest economy in the world. What ought the state to be doing then to confront some of these issues?
Well, New York State has really attempted to take a lead in global climate change. It's built alliances with other states, such as Washington, Oregon, and California, to commit to the standards in the Paris Accord. And if enough states band together to do that, the states effectively make federal policy. And businesses are proceeding on lowering emissions, improving fuel efficiency, making those changes, investing in the technologies that are going to be used to combat climate change, because they know that what happens in the Oval Office in the United States may shift and go completely the other direction in 4 years. So they are looking at what the global trends are and are planning according to that. So I think that as New York continues to realize the power that it has when working together with other states, it can really make an impact on these issues.
So we are about at the end of our time. I'm going to give you the last word. I think as I listen to you all summing up. It seems to me that we're just talking about short-term optimism. We're doing well enough. Long-term serious concerns.
Well, we've always had long-term serious concerns, and the short-term concerns are, of course, we're getting late in the current stock market economic interest rate cycle, and it's not trees don't grow to the sky, and so there's probably going to face the both financial markets as well as the state of New York. The state of New York does not do well when we have recessions. I've got those numbers, but just take my word for it, and that's not a surprise to anyone. So when we say short-term problems, I think, Rex, the short term is a real economic issue that it's not the time to be taking a lot of risk, whether you're running a business or whether you're running the economy. Longer term, we've always had significant problems. You mentioned the environment, that's certainly at the top of the list. The second one is income inequality. I don't have the answers. On the economics, on the environment side, I would invite everybody to go back to 1970. The one thing that Richard Nixon did right, which was really Muskie that did it, it wasn't Nixon, was on emission controls in 1970. Read about that, and you'll see that you can't depend on the private sector to voluntarily take steps. So I'm really happy to hear that states are getting together to do something about the environment, and hopefully they'll be effective. Either the states collectively or the federal government maybe will join the parade at some point in time and do something that it's a really serious problem. So we have some serious long-term problems, but I think, quite frankly, we've got the spirit and the know-how to solve those problems. So yes, they're formidable, but we can do something.
A great conversation that could go on all afternoon, but we did promise to get you out of here. So what a smart conversation. Thank you all. Kahil Lahiri, Laura Schultz, and Hugh Johnson, thank you, and thanks to you all for joining us.